I was in a serious car accident with my wife and discovered she had been cheating on me for years with her boss, who was the first to arrive at the hospital. I never thought an ordinary night would become the turning point of my life. The asphalt was slick with rain, visibility was terrible, and the tension inside the car was even heavier than the weather. My wife sat next to me, glued to her phone as always, completely ignoring me. We were driving home from one of her work events, the kind I never wanted to attend but always ended up going to for the sake of peace. She insisted these events were crucial for her career, but something deep down kept whispering that there was more to it. The road was dark, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. My mind kept replaying the scene from earlier that night. Her boss, the impeccably polished man, had been far too close to her all evening. The private laughter, the whispered conversations. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it, that I was just being paranoid, but something felt off. There was a familiarity between them I couldn't ignore. Then it happened, the moment that changed everything. Bright headlights blinded us, and before I could react, a violent impact shattered the night. The sound of twisting metal, breaking glass, and my wife's screams filled the air. It all happened in seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The car spun several times before coming to a stop in a ditch by the side of the road. Pain tore through my chest, and blood blurred my vision. My only thought was of her, praying she was alive. "Are you okay?" I yelled, struggling to undo my seatbelt with shaking hands. No response. I turned to see her unconscious, a trickle of blood running down her forehead. My heart stopped. With trembling fingers, I reached for my phone to call 911. But before I could explain what had happened, sirens were already wailing in the distance. Paramedics arrived quickly, and chaos erupted. They pulled me from the car, strapped me to a stretcher, but all I could focus on was her. Everything was a blur of flashing lights, shouting voices, and pouring rain. I was slipping into shock when I saw him. Standing next to an ambulance in the middle of all the chaos was her boss. Somehow, he was already there before the police had even finished securing the scene. What the hell is he doing here? I thought, as physical pain mixed with a growing sense of betrayal and rage. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be a coincidence. My suspicions started to solidify as I watched him move with a kind of urgency that felt far too personal, speaking to the paramedics as though he was her husband. At the hospital, things only got worse. While I was being observed, I caught glimpses of him in the hallways, asking questions, demanding updates on her condition. I saw him holding her hand while she was unconscious, as though she belonged to him. That's when doubt turned into certainty. Something wasn't right, and that night had only been the beginning. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body wrecked and my head pounding as if a hammer was smashing against it nonstop. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the harsh ceiling lights reminded me I was far from home, stuck in a place where masks fall and the truth comes out. Everything was a blur at first. Flashes of the accident, the suffocating grip of the seatbelt, and her face, my wife's face, bloodied and lifeless. As my vision cleared, I scanned the room. That's when I saw him, her boss, sitting in a chair near the bed. Not mine, of course, but hers in the room next door. His posture was far too casual for someone who was just a work superior. He didn't notice me, but I saw everything. His hand resting on hers, a gentle stroke that left no room for doubt. That wasn't the touch of a friend, let alone a boss. It was the touch of a man staking his claim. I wanted to get up, march over, and confront him right then and there, but the pain in my broken body held me back. Besides, what could I say? Accuse him without proof? Demand answers in the middle of a hospital? All I could do was watch, piecing it together while the bitterness of suspicion slowly consumed me. A nurse walked in to check my vitals, interrupting the storm raging in my mind. I tried to keep my face neutral, but my pulse must have been racing, and not just because of my injuries. When I asked about my wife, she responded calmly, "She's stable. She's being treated in the next room." What she didn't say, but I already knew, was that she wasn't alone. He was there with her, and he wasn't going anywhere. Desperation took over. I asked the nurse to help me sit up. I needed to see her. I couldn't rest until I saw her with my own eyes. The nurse hesitated, concerned about my condition, but I insisted. I convinced her I wouldn't have peace otherwise. Reluctantly, she helped me stand and led me to the doorway of the room next door. What I saw when I pushed that door open was a punch straight to the gut. My wife was awake, bandages wrapped around her head, but instead of looking relieved or worried about me, she was smiling, softly, almost sweetly, at him. He was leaning in close, whispering something too intimate to be professional. For a moment, neither of them noticed me, as if I didn't exist. "What's going on here?" I managed to say, my voice weaker than I had hoped. Both of them froze and turned to look at me, startled. My wife's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mix of guilt and shock. He, on the other hand, didn't flinch. His face remained calm, like he had nothing to hide. That's when I realized I was playing on his turf, and he knew it. "I was just making sure she's okay," he said with a calmness that sent a fresh wave of anger through me. My wife said nothing, avoiding my eyes as though she couldn't bear to face me. Something inside me shattered. I wanted to scream, demand answers, but I held back. This wasn't the time or place to blow up. There was more at play here, and I knew the full truth would reveal itself soon enough. I returned to my room, my body and spirit barely holding together. My mind raced, replaying every suspicious moment. The late nights at work, the urgent meetings, the texts she always seemed to delete. I'd ignored the signs, and now, everything was laid bare before me. But if they thought I was going to sit back and accept this betrayal quietly, they were dead wrong. This was just the beginning, and I was determined to uncover every last detail. And when I did, I wasn't planning to go down silently. Back in my hospital bed, the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm raging inside me. The doubts that had haunted me for months now had a face, and that face was sitting next to my wife as if he had every right in the world to be there. But I couldn't act impulsively. My body was weak, and my mind needed clarity before taking any step. That night, insomnia became my only companion. The sound of monitors, the footsteps of the medical staff, and the distant murmur of other patients couldn't drown out the whispers between my wife and her boss. I stared at the ceiling, mentally replaying all the signs I had ignored. The way she dressed up more than usual for work, the excuses to stay late at the office, the times she avoided eye contact when she got home. It was all there like a puzzle I had finally pieced together. I wasn't going to let them get away with it, but I knew I couldn't rush. I needed proof, something solid that would expose their betrayal to my eyes and, more importantly, to everyone else. And for that, I had to play smart. The first step was finding someone I could trust. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I called my best friend, Raul. He was the kind of person who always had a plan, someone who wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. When I explained what I had seen and suspected, his response was immediate. "We're going to make sure they pay for what they're doing to you." Raul wasted no time. While I was stuck in that bed, he began digging, combing through social media, tracing call patterns, and eventually hiring a private investigator. It was an extreme move, I knew, but this wasn't a normal situation. My marriage, my trust, even my dignity were at stake. If there was more I didn't know, I was going to find it. Meanwhile, I had to endure the discomfort of sharing space with my wife in the hospital. Her attitude was baffling. She acted as if nothing had happened, as if everything I had seen wasn't enough to raise suspicions. She even tried to sit by my side and hold my hand, but I pulled away, pretending my arm hurt too much. I couldn't even look at her without a wave of anger and sadness washing over me. Days later, Raul returned with news. The investigator had found something. Messages between my wife and her boss. They were worse than I had imagined. They weren't just romantic. There was a level of complicity that showed this had been going on for years. Promises of getaways, criticisms of me, even laughter at my expense. Every word was a dagger to my heart, but it also fueled my determination. "It's not enough to expose them," Raul told me. "You need to make sure they feel what you're feeling." That was when I decided my reaction wouldn't be immediate. If I wanted justice and a little revenge, I had to wait for the perfect moment. Patience became my new weapon, and in the meantime, I started acting like everything was fine. I pretended I didn't know anything, letting my wife believe she had me under control. If she thought I was still the same naive man, all the better for me. But inside, I was building a plan. Something that wouldn't just reveal their betrayal, but would also force them to face the consequences of their actions. It wouldn't be enough to confront her in private. I needed everything to come to light in the most devastating way possible. With every passing day, it became harder to maintain the facade of normalcy. But I knew I had to. Every fake smile I offered my wife was another brick in the wall I was building around my plan. Inside, I was devastated, but outwardly, I had to be the man who still appeared oblivious to the truth. Meanwhile, Raul and the private investigator worked with surgical precision to gather more evidence. One night, while my wife was seemingly asleep in a hospital chair, I checked her phone. Unlocking it hadn't been easy, but years of living together had given me clues. What I found was worse than I imagined. Explicit messages between her and her boss, laughing at my blindness and discussing plans to be together. There were even references to how he would pick her up once I was no longer in the picture, as if I were just an obstacle in their perfect love story. I felt rage surge through me, but I took a deep breath. This wasn't the time to lose my temper. Instead of confronting her, I took screenshots of the messages and emailed them to myself, carefully erasing all traces of what I'd done. That night, I realized the only way to come out of this with my dignity intact was to ensure her downfall was as public as her betrayal. The next step was finding the perfect moment for the confrontation. Fate unknowingly handed me the ideal opportunity. About a week later, my wife casually informed me that her boss was hosting a small party to celebrate her promotion. She invited me with a smile so fake it was almost laughable. Did she really think I would go and play the doting husband? But I accepted the invitation, feigning enthusiasm. It was exactly what I needed. Raul and I worked tirelessly on the preparations. We coordinated with the investigator to ensure all the evidence we had collected could be presented conclusively. Emails, text messages, photos of them together in places I was told didn't exist, all compiled into a video that left no room for doubt. It was a montage of lies, deceit, and betrayal distilled into a few damning minutes. The day of the party arrived. Despite barely being able to walk unaided, I showed up dressed sharply, exuding confidence that masked the storm inside me. My wife seemed uneasy about my decision to attend but said nothing. When we arrived, her boss, the man who had been the shadow behind our relationship, greeted me with a smile so smug it almost made me lose my composure. But no, I had to wait. The gathering was small but carefully curated, filled with the right people. My wife's coworkers, her bosses, and even some mutual friends. While everyone enjoyed drinks and made small talk, I ensured the technical team was ready for the big moment. I had discreetly rented a projector and arranged with the venue staff to play the video at the appointed time. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, observing as my wife and her boss exchanged glances they thought no one noticed. I wasn't sure whether to feel disgusted, pity, or a mix of both. But one thing was certain: their arrogance was about to crumble. Finally, the moment came. I stood up with difficulty, leaning on my crutch, and called for everyone's attention with a tap on my glass. I just want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate this important milestone for my wife, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Then, with a tone Raul recognized as the signal, I added, "But tonight deserves more than words. It deserves clarity." With that, the video began to play. Laughter and murmurs died instantly, replaced by gasps of disbelief, looks of shame, and, in the case of my wife and her boss, a pallor that almost made me feel sorry for them. Almost. The footage spoke for itself. The texts, the photos, the clandestine meetings. It was a brutal dissection of their betrayal, displayed in front of the people they respected most. The silence was deafening, and in that moment, I knew I had achieved exactly what I intended. The silence in the room after the footage played was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The faces of those present oscillated between disbelief and disgust, while the stars of the show, my wife and her boss, seemed frozen in place. My wife, always so calculated, was paralyzed, as though she couldn't decide whether to burst into tears, beg for forgiveness, or make a run for it. Her boss, that man who had the audacity to approach me as a friend so many times, was pale. His jaw clenched as if trying to keep himself from breaking apart. I took a moment to breathe deeply and take in their reactions. I wanted them to feel every second of that humiliation. Then, with a calmness even I didn't know I possessed, I broke the silence. Thank you all for taking the time to join me tonight. I wanted you to see what I recently discovered because, after all, I think the truth deserves to come out, don't you? The boss tried to jump in. This isn't what it looks like, he stammered, his voice shaking as much as his hands. It was such a worn-out, predictable line that I almost laughed. I ignored him completely and turned my attention to my wife, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. Not what it looks like. Well then, why don't you explain, sweetheart? What exactly are we seeing here? Maybe we're all wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her attempts at justification were so clumsy and incoherent that a few people in the crowd began murmuring among themselves. In one corner, her boss's superior, his direct supervisor, looked outraged. It was clear this wouldn't just have personal consequences. It was going to get professional too. That realization filled me with a satisfaction that's hard to put into words. After a few minutes of this uncomfortable display, I decided it was enough. I wasn't there to drag this out longer than necessary. I just wanted to close this chapter of my life with the dignity they had tried to rob from me. I approached my wife, who was still crying as tears streamed down her face, and handed her an envelope. This is for you. It's the divorce papers. Don't worry, I've handled everything. And believe me, I've been more than fair. The room erupted in murmurs of astonishment. She could barely hold the envelope with her trembling hands. Her boss tried again, this time with a firmer tone. You don't have the right to do this in public, he spat, trying to regain some control. My cold, calculated gaze stopped him in his tracks. Don't have the right? It's funny hearing that from someone who never had the right to interfere in my marriage. But don't worry, I think everyone here has a pretty clear idea of who's out of line. The final blow came when, with a mix of sarcasm and sincerity, I added, and by the way, since we're being transparent, I sent the video to Human Resources. I'm sure they'll have plenty to discuss with you on Monday. The tension couldn't have been higher. As the boss hastily retreated, likely realizing his career had just ended, my wife remained frozen, her face a shattered mask of regret. I turned to the crowd, raised my glass and said, to everyone else, thank you for being here. The truth sometimes hurts, but as they say, it sets you free. Have a great night. The crowd began to disperse slowly, most too embarrassed to approach me directly. I, on the other hand, felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. As I walked toward the exit, leaning on my cane, every step felt like it carried me further away from pain and closer to freedom. When I walked out of that room with my head held high, I felt as though the world had finally aligned in my favor. The humiliation they had put me through, the pain they had inflicted, it had all come back to them like a hurricane, leaving me with a clear path forward. But the ultimate closure wasn't just about exposing their betrayals. It was about rediscovering who I was after years of living under the shadow of their deceit. That first night back in the house I once shared with my wife was strange. The silence was deafening, but not the kind of silence that consumes you. It was peaceful, a reminder that while solitude was new to me, it was also my chance to start over. Sitting at the dining table with a glass of wine, I reviewed the divorce papers. I had been fair but firm. I wasn't going to leave her with anything more than what was legally required. Not out of revenge, but because I realized she had already taken everything she could from me emotionally. I owed her nothing else. The next day, I decided to revisit a project I had put on hold for years, starting my own business. It was a dream I had before getting married, but between the demands of my marriage and the sacrifices I made to support my wife's aspirations, it had been forgotten. Now, with no one holding me back or distracting me, I dove in headfirst. I reached out to old colleagues, sought out strategic partners, and gradually reignited the spark that had once fueled my ambition. The transformation wasn't quick or easy. There were days when getting out of bed felt impossible, haunted by the memories of what had happened. But every small step I took toward rebuilding my life was a victory over my past. I began focusing on my health, both physical and mental. I returned to therapy, something I had stopped because my wife dismissed it as a waste of time. I joined a gym, and even though the accident had left permanent scars, I discovered my body still had the strength to move forward. Meanwhile, my ex-wife's life seemed to take a very different turn. After news of her affair with her boss spread, much of her social circle distanced themselves. Friends who had once supported her found themselves uncomfortable with the public disgrace she carried. To make matters worse, her boss lost his job, taking with him any financial stability she might have had. In a desperate attempt to salvage her life, she reached out to me multiple times, sending messages and letters filled with apologies, claiming she had made a terrible mistake. Every word I read was a reminder of how much my perspective had changed. I no longer felt anger or resentment, just indifference. The final nail in the coffin came when she tried to use one of my friends to reconnect with me. She called me one last time, her voice more defeated than I had ever heard it. She begged me to meet her, to at least hear her out. I agreed, but not for her sake. I did it for me, to make it clear that I was no longer the person she had manipulated and betrayed. When we met, it was clear she wasn't doing well. The confident woman I had once known now seemed insecure and broken. She tried to appeal to my emotions, saying we could still fix things, that we had shared so much together. I listened calmly, and when she finished, I told her firmly, "The man you're hoping to win back doesn't exist anymore. You destroyed him, but from those ruins, I've built someone stronger. I don't hate you, but there's no place for you in my life anymore." It was the ultimate release. For the first time, I felt the weight of that relationship lift completely. She cried, but I didn't stay to comfort her. I knew my compassion wouldn't save her from the consequences of her choices. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt invincible. I had reclaimed my life and, more importantly, my self-respect. My business began to thrive, and with every professional milestone, my confidence grew. Later, I even met someone new. A woman who saw me not as a provider or a resource, but as an equal partner. That's when I realized that love shouldn't be a battle for control but a genuine collaboration. Life moved on, and while the scars of the past remained, I now wore them with pride. They were reminders of how far I had come. My ex-wife and her boss became nothing more than a footnote in my story, a chapter that no longer defined me. What started as a devastating betrayal ultimately became the catalyst for my greatest triumph. And so, the story that could have broken me ended up becoming the foundation for the most victorious chapter of my life. I hope this story resonated with you as much as it did with me while sharing it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.